Hello, friends. We are interested in the geography of our views, so please like and write in the comments from which city are you watching us, and were there loud stories of betrayal in your city? Share your stories with us. Maybe the next betrayal story will be from your city, and we start. David woke up this morning with a feeling of pleasant excitement. 17 years ago, he and Laura said their vows of fidelity to each other in a small church on the outskirts of Los Angeles. Then they were young, full of hope, and seemed ready to move mountains for love. Now they have two teenage children. Maddie, who disappears for days with her new hobby of shooting videos, and Travis, who spends time playing computer games and periodically goes outside only to run with friends. But today is a special day. David took the day off to buy his beloved wife a present worthy of their anniversary. He had his eye on a diamond pendant in advance. Laura accidentally saw it in a jewelry store last fall and looked at it for a long time, so that lust and slight sadness shone in her eyes, because then they could not afford such luxury. At work, David finished early, grabbing a bottle of champagne from a nearby grocery store on the way. My heart was pounding with anticipation, almost like the first day they met. She will be delighted, he thought. She will again remember how youth and passion still beat within us. It seemed that the day promised to be perfect. He quietly opened the front door and was surprised to note the unusual silence. It's like there's no one at home. Usually at this time Laura was preparing dinner, rattling dishes, complaining about high electricity bills, or talking animatedly on the phone with a friend. Today it seems to have disappeared. There are no signs of life in the corridor. David put the champagne on the kitchen table, clutched the neat box with the pendant, and went upstairs to the bedroom. He was full of impatience. Pictures of a romantic evening flashed in his head, where he and Laura poured champagne for each other, laughed, and recalled happy moments of the past. Today is their 17th wedding anniversary, a date they usually celebrated with a family dinner or a small weekend trip. As David walked up the stairs, he thought, Laura must have dozed off, or she's reading a novel, as she likes to do when the kids are with friends. Perhaps a surprise awaits me. He smiled, imagining how Laura would beam when she saw a box with such decoration. He remembered very well how last fall she looked at the pendant in the window of a jewelry store, dreamily putting her palm to her neck. However, something in the atmosphere of the house was subtly tense. The silence was too thick, as if there was no one here. Maybe she went out for a walk, a thought flashed through, but then Laura would probably have left a note. Doubt arose in the depths of my consciousness, and slight anxiety tightened my chest. David pushed the bedroom door open carefully. The familiar aroma of Laura's perfume, mixed with some sharp foreign smell, filled her nose. He stopped for a moment, frowned, but resolutely went inside. And then he realized that before his eyes was a scene that he could not imagine even in his worst nightmare. Laura was reclining on the bed with a completely unfamiliar man nearby. No, it was not just intimacy. They had sex so openly and deeply that they did not notice anything around them. The sound of blood hit David's temples. He seemed to have lost touch with reality. A short flash appeared in his head. A wedding where he and Laura exchanged vows. The birth of Maddie and Travis, their first steps, a joint vacation in the mountains. All these memories flashed before my eyes like a whirlwind, immediately losing all their importance. Laura, David whispered with only his lips, but his voice did not obey. He stood motionless, clutching the box with the pendant in his hand until it almost broke. The silence of the room was barely broken by barely audible music from another room apparently. Someone's phone was playing a monotonous playlist. The usual noise outside the window indicated that life outside the walls was going on as usual, but here, in their marital nest, everything was collapsing. Finally, they noticed him. More precisely, Laura noticed. She turned around, and her face showed neither remorse nor horror, only irritation, as if she had been interrupted at the wrong moment. "Can you go out for a couple of hours?" she said coldly, not trying to cover herself with either a sheet or clothes. "We'll finish, then we'll talk." David tried to understand whether he was really hearing these exact words. His throat was seized with a spasm, as if an invisible garrote was preventing him from breathing. Laura. He squeezed out only her name, feeling his heart pounding in his ears. He wanted to ask, "What's going on? Why are you doing this? Aren't we family?" But the words were stuck in a lump of fear and resentment. He looked at his wife's face and saw no traces of embarrassment or repentance in it. All she seemed to feel was the discomfort of being caught. "Listen, David," Laura emphasized more insistently, "please come out. I don't want to discuss it now." The stranger next to her only gave David a quick glance, full of indifference or maybe secret superiority, and continued to casually kiss Laura. They really didn't seem to see anything special about it. The outburst of rage was so strong that David almost threw the box with the pendant at them. He imagined how the diamond flew into the face of the cheater, heard the dull thud of the jewelry on the body, but his hand did not rise. Something inside did not allow him to show violence, even in such a situation. But every moment felt like a blow to the chest: humiliation, disappointment, anger, bitterness. "Do you even understand what you're doing?" he hissed, trying to control his trembling. Laura rolled her eyes. "Can you not make a scene, David? If you come back in a couple of hours, everything will be fine." How dare she speak as if I were the odd one out in my own home? Flashed through David's mind. He wanted to say something, to express everything that was boiling inside. "We have gone through half our lives together. You are the mother of my children." But his throat tightened. His own helplessness overwhelmed him, because there is no quick answer to indifference and contempt. "I loved you," he whispered barely audibly, clenching his fists. "And we were a family." "How so?" Laura sighed, as if feeling slightly annoyed. "David, don't you really understand that things haven't been like this for a long time?" "I'm not going to have a dialogue now. Go away." It was like a knife went through my heart. "Has it been like this for a long time?" David repeated to himself. Was he so blind that he didn't notice the coldness that had entered their relationship? Or did she deliberately hide everything and now say that it was all over a long time ago? The stranger didn't even turn to face David, as if confirming that there was no drama here, but simply a mechanical fact. The wife is cheating, and the husband can only get out. Tears stung his eyes, but David could not allow himself to cry in front of them. He felt a wave of vomit splashing in his stomach, caused by a mixture of humiliation and rage. My fingers were numb from the strong compression of the box with the pendant. My heart was pounding in my temples. "Laura, He tried to start, but the tears still froze in his throat. "That's enough," the wife said now impatiently. "I warned you. Give us time." The last words finished off David. It was as if he had been torn out of reality and thrown into some gray void. The wife with whom he lived for so many years and gave birth to 2 children throws it in his face that she just wants to continue the love affair here and now. The softly smoldering rage suddenly gave way to the full realization that he could do nothing. Neither a fight with a stranger nor a tantrum in front of Laura will regain his respect or restore the past. All the words are stuck, all meaning is lost. What he believed in was crumbling before his eyes. David slowly turned around, without closing the door behind him, and walked out into the corridor. As if in a fog, he heard Laura say something to her lover in a half-whisper there, in the bedroom. His soul was torn by thoughts of children. God, Maddie and Travis are growing up in a house where their mother has no respect for their father. How can we continue to live? Steps were difficult. Walking downstairs into the living room, he saw photographs on the wall. Happy faces of families when the children were babies, when they went camping, when they celebrated birthdays. All this now seemed like a terrible mockery. The gaze settled on a bottle of champagne standing on the kitchen table. Why is it needed now? With what face did he even take her? David took the bottle and squeezed the neck with his fingers. In a fit of despair, he almost threw her into the wall. But at the last moment he restrained himself, as if fearing his own anger. "I need to leave," he thought, "before I do something irreparable." He sharply opened the kitchen cabinet door and fished out a paper bag. He opened the box with the pendant and looked at the sparkling diamond, which was supposed to become a symbol of their love, and a new chapter in their relationship. Instead, it will now become a symbol of betrayal. With a quiet groan, David dropped the jewel into the bag and squeezed it angrily, crushing it. "How could she?" he whispered, feeling his voice trembling from the tears that still began to appear in his eyes. On the stairs, he went down slowly, as if someone's hand was pulling him down. Once in the living room, he paused for a moment. The gaze fell on the photographs on the wall. Family photos from a picnic at Lake Tahoe, a smiling Laura holding little Maddie in her arms, and David helping Travis learn to roller skate. These shots were saturated with happiness, which now seemed like an illusion. My thoughts were racing. Should I take the car and leave? But where? Who to call? Should I tell the children? How to live further? He felt that going back upstairs and causing a scene was unthinkable, and staying within these walls was painful. Inhaling the painfully sharp air, David took the bottle of champagne from the table. He threw the pendant into the nearest trash can, because at that moment the decoration became the personification of deception and broken hopes, and he just walked towards the exit. "Forever," he whispered to himself as he closed the door behind him. The autumn wind blew across his face, and the sobering cool air hit his nerves again. There was a car parked in front of the house and a dog barking next door. The world went on as usual, not even suspecting that an invisible explosion had just occurred in this quiet American family residence. Getting into the car, David closed his eyes for a second, trying to find at least some explanation. But her indifferent voice still sounded in her mind. "We'll finish, then we'll talk." Starting the engine, he looked in the rearview mirror, as if hoping to see a different reality there. But all he saw was his own detachment and an instantly aged face. He didn't want to be here for another second. At that moment, David made a decision from which he was no longer going to retreat. The night in a cheap motel passed for David in a blur. Just yesterday, he was leading an ordinary family life. Admittedly, it had long been devoid of spark, but still stable and familiar. Now he had neither a home nor confidence in the future. In a musty room with stains on the carpet and a creaking bed, he tried to sleep, but two fresh memories swirled in his head. Betrayal, a strange man in his bed, Laura's indifferent gaze. Remembering how she didn't even try to justify herself, how her gaze remained cold and irritated, David again and again felt a pang of humiliation. But mixed with deep resentment was a strange determination. He knew for sure that he did not intend to forgive and try to start over. He is not one of those who will live in despair, making everyone around him believe that everything can be returned to normal. Now he had only one thing left: to leave as cleanly and irrevocably as possible. He lay on the sagging mattress, looking at the ceiling, where from the weak light of the bedside lamp one could see traces of old water stains. In the morning, a new life was about to begin, and he, without expecting it, already felt something akin to relief. Painfully bitter, but liberating. After several hours of half asleep, David finally dozed off in the wee hours. He woke up around 6 in the morning, exhausted, as if he had been carrying sandbags all night. Outside the window, Saturday morning was beginning, and the city was slowly coming to life. The neon light, the advertising by the road, was almost no longer visible. It gave way to the cold dawn glow. David sat on the edge of the bed, ran his hand over his unshaven chin, and wondered where exactly to start. First, he wanted to call Laura, not to ask for forgiveness or reprimand insults, but to say a few key words. But estimating that his voice might break from emotion, and even more so that he was unlikely to hear anything intelligible from his wife, he decided, later, after, or it's not worth it at all. The first thought that came to mind: leave, disappear, and do it quickly before she has a chance to change something, freeze accounts, or spoil documents. He didn't intend to take revenge, but he was going to avoid any surprises and save his own life. In addition, he knew that in their state, family legal relations are sometimes treacherous, and if he did not take steps now, he risked being left with nothing. He called a moving company that he knew from colleagues. It was a company with the sonorous name Speedy Move 24/7. He once helped a friend move, and he said that these guys would come even in the middle of the night if you paid enough. The call center employee, who introduced himself as Mike, answered cheerfully. "Good morning, Speedy Move 24/7. How can I help?" Hearing the note of amusement in Mike's voice, David felt for a second that he was doing something out of the ordinary. But it was too late to retreat. "I urgently need to take my things out. Today, preferably right now. I am ready to pay double the rate for urgency." "But I have special conditions," David said as evenly as possible. "Of course, we can discuss the details. Where exactly to come and when?" David explained that only his personal belongings would need to be loaded. He decided to leave children's furniture, family photo albums, and other items related to children or home. Not because he didn't like children, on the contrary. The question was nagging in his soul how to inform Maddie and Travis about what had happened, how they would accept this blow. But now the main thing is to have time to remove all the men's accessories and take the most necessary things before anyone resists or blocks the doors. We need to do everything as quickly and accurately as possible. I will not be personally present during loading. My friend will open the door for you. He already knows. Work with him. Then contact me when everything is loaded into the car, he clarified. "That's all?" Mike questioned again. "Yes, I will inform you about the unloading location later, after you leave the address. I hope everything goes without problems." They agreed on a double rate, and David felt a pang in his wallet, but now money was not the main thing. He knew that he was withdrawing funds from the joint account, dividing everything equally as required by law. His own part is enough for him not to think about money for the coming months. And it doesn't matter what Laura thinks or thinks, every penny he leaves her is more than she would like after the betrayal. After finishing the call, David dialed the bank's number. It was necessary to set up a transfer to a foreign account, which he opened a year ago as part of one project, but has not yet used it. The bank initially asked for details, but as soon as they heard that the client was ready to transfer a significant amount, they immediately offered a personal manager. I had to spend about 20 minutes clarifying all the details, confirming my identity, and discussing commissions. But in the end, everything worked as it should. David made sure that exactly half of the joint savings would remain in Laura's name, not a cent more. The bank's systems were strict, but for a person with legal literacy and documents, everything turned out to be feasible. "She won't get a penny more," he thought as he filled out the online form. "This is my principled position. I'm honest. I give her exactly half. She didn't deserve any more." He didn't feel anger, but rather cold determination. This harshness spread inside him, not allowing him to soften and compromise. It seemed that the acute pain he experienced had burned away all remnants of his former naivety. David sat on the edge of the bed for about half an hour, thinking about how he would tell the children. Maddie is already 16, Travis is 14. They are too old not to notice that their father has disappeared and too young to cope without explanation. Or maybe they had long suspected that the mother had some kind of secret. He didn't know for sure. Over the last couple of years, tension and omissions often arose in their family, and perhaps the children noticed how their mother disappeared in the evenings or how she absent-mindedly answered their questions. But damn, they deserve a conversation, David thought. However, imagining the emotional scene, realizing that the children could side with their mother, or conversely hate her, he felt a dull pain in his chest. Be that as it may, he doesn't have the strength to have this conversation right now. Perhaps it will be easier to do this from afar, when he himself has cooled down a little and put his thoughts in order. He would text Maddie and Travis, explain the situation without the nasty details. Children don't need to know all the details. But it is necessary to make it clear that he is not abandoning them, but is only leaving that house where there is no longer room for respect for him. The decision was made. He left the motel, got into the car, and drove to a friend whom he had known for a long time from work. He was a former police officer who was still on friendly terms with David. They went fishing together a couple of times, and David knew that he could trust him when the time was right. This friend, whose name was Carl, agreed to open the door for the moving crew to make sure that they only took what belonged to David. They agreed to meet in an inconspicuous cafe on the outskirts to discuss the details. When David entered the cafe, Carl was already sitting at a table in the corner, sipping coffee. He looked as if he had run out of the house in a hurry. In a fairly wrinkled sweater, his hair was disheveled. When he saw David, he stood up and shook his hand firmly. "Dove, what kind of emergency is this?" he asked anxiously, but without unnecessary sentimentality. "It's a long story," David answered quietly, sat down on a chair, and ran his hand over his face. "But believe me, I really need your visit to my former home. You need to meet the movers and follow the process. Take only my things, clothes, tools, some personal documents. I left a folder on the kitchen table, just in case. If Laura or her, I don't know, some friend starts popping up, let me know, but I hope everything goes smoothly." Carl frowned, looking at David suspiciously. "Former house, you were just talking about your wedding anniversary yesterday. Did something happen? I don't understand how it's like this." David chuckled nervously. "Believe me, sometimes people present very unpleasant surprises. I'm leaving, and most likely we will get a divorce. Therefore, I need to remove all things without a scandal, and as quickly as possible." "I see," Carl sighed and leaned closer. "Are you sure everything is exactly as you decided?" "Carl, I saw it with my own eyes." David spoke quietly, but there was a steely tone in his words. "I don't want to explain any more. Can you help?" "Okay." The friend nodded briefly. "Give me the coordinates, instructions on what exactly to load, and then what should I do after?" "Everything is in this folder." David took out a small blue folder from his bag, which contained printed photographs of his things, an inventory, and the address of the temporary storage warehouse. "When the trucks leave my yard, you will receive a call from me. I'll tell you where to take everything. I just don't want Laura to know the address in advance. Then I'll give you compensation for today's troubles." They agreed on a time. The moving trucks were supposed to arrive by 12 noon, which meant Carl still had about an hour to get there. David, having a good idea of Laura's character, assumed that she could either run away somewhere or try to make a scene, but in any case, he did not want to be there personally. David's insides were tense with the thought that a stranger was probably still sleeping in his once cozy home, perhaps even using his shower or drinking coffee from his favorite mug. But he decided to close his eyes to this. After all, just yesterday he was convinced with his own eyes that all the bridges had been burned, and he didn't need anything from his old life. An hour later, David was sitting in his car in the parking lot, looking at his phone. A message came from Carl. "The truck has arrived. I launched them. Laura is not at home. At least the door is open and the bedroom light is on. The neighbors look with interest, but don't ask questions." David breathed a sigh of relief, glad that he wouldn't have to deal with either her or the guy he found. He replied, "Thank you. Write if something is wrong. And don't forget to throw away all my clothes from the top drawer of the dresser. I don't want to leave anything there as incriminating evidence." He wanted to get rid of any memories. All these t-shirts and sweaters, saturated with the smell of home, now seemed like a burden, pulling into the past. Maybe in the future he will regret it, but now he won't. Inside, only the desire to cut everything off to the ground was pulsating. Another 40 minutes passed. Carl called. "Listen, there's no problem, but there's an interesting point." Travis returned home. Apparently, the running training is over. He asks what is happening. "Why are your things being taken away?" I don't know what to tell him. He said that you left for a while and asked not to interfere. David closed his eyes. This is what he was so afraid of, direct contact with children. But he didn't want Carl to be forced to lie. However, what to do right now on the phone? "Give it to me," David asked. A second later, he heard his son's alarmed voice. "Dad, what's happening?" "There are some movers here taking out all your things. Carl said you left, but is it because of work?" David heard his heart ache. The son is used to the fact that his father sometimes leaves on business, but obviously not in this format. "Hello, son. I'm sorry I didn't have time to tell you. I left home. I'll live somewhere else." David said quietly, holding back his emotions. "I'll call you later and explain everything. It's not because of you, and it's not because of Maddie. It just happened that way. All you need to know now, I love you, and we will definitely meet. I won't leave you." But there was fear and confusion in the son's voice. "Where is Mom?" "I don't know," David answered honestly. "Most likely, it will appear soon. Tell her. Don't say anything. I'll decide everything myself. Carl will sort everything out here. I'll call you later, okay?" Travis was silent for several seconds, breathing heavily into the phone. "Okay," he finally said, and in this word one could hear teenage protest mixed with misunderstanding. "Just Dad, come on faster." Horns. The conversation ended. David sat for a long time, looking at the phone. Somewhere deep inside, he understood how traumatic what happened was for his son. He could well be disappointed in his father and decide that David abandoned his family. But David swore to himself. Most likely, when the passions subsided, he would try to get the right to joint custody or reach an amicable agreement, just so as not to cause severe mental pain to the children. The small office, where David entered a little earlier than the appointed time, was in twilight. The curtains were half drawn, and the autumn rain was drizzling outside the window. Brian, his lawyer, was sitting at the table and, seeing his client, motioned for him to sit down. The room smelled of coffee and fresh printing ink. It was clear that mountains of papers were often rummaged through here. "I have news," Brian began immediately, resting his chin on his intertwined fingers. "Whether the news is good or bad is up to you to decide, but it will definitely change your perspective on the whole situation." David felt a chilling sense of foreboding inside him. He collected himself internally and leaned forward a little. "Speak. Do you remember we discussed who your wife's lover could be and how this would affect our divorce proceedings? So, we did some investigation." The lawyer nodded towards the weighty folder on the table. "We brought in private detectives, checked accounts, telephone records, and some electronic traces. And they found out that one of the people Laura cheated on you with was your boss, James Phillips." For a split second, David froze and then smiled bitterly. "I knew that something like this would come up in this story. There were rumors that he was too attentive to his employees, but I never thought that he would set his sights on my wife." He faltered, and the feeling of resentment, long suppressed, suddenly surged with renewed vigor. It turned out that Betrayal was literally next to him. The person he worked for could deceive for months, looking him in the eyes, and perhaps, together with Laura, ridiculing him behind his back. "Sorry to ask," Brian began with doubt in his voice, "but did you somehow guess about this? Or was Phillips acting strange?" "No, perhaps not." David lowered his gaze. "He was always polite, praised me for my successes, and even increased my salary a couple of times. And he never showed any signs of personal hostility. There was not even a hint that he could do this." Brian sighed. "Life is full of surprises, but that's not all. Our detectives have dug up other facts. It turned out that Laura had at least 4 men on her side over the past 8 years. Moreover, some of her connections overlapped in time. It appears that Phillips is just one of them." David felt dizzy for a moment. It was as if someone was squeezing his chest with all their strength. Memories of how he racked his brains, trying to understand when exactly their family life cracked, flashed, and went out. Now it turned out that it had cracked many years ago. And him. All these years he lived in the illusion that the family was only going through ordinary crises like many, but the basis was still mutual loyalty. "Tell me, is this for sure?" he asked chokedly. "Of course," Brian nodded. "We even have photographs, but I decided that you shouldn't look at them. It is enough that the court will confirm this if it comes to litigation. We don't have to resort to court if Laura agrees to divorce by amicable agreement. But there are additional consequences." David tensed, expecting a catch, but Brian grinned. "In fact, they concern Phillips himself. It looks like he had an infidelity clause in his marriage contract with his wife. And since she has evidence of his affairs in particular, with Laura, he faces a large payout. in the range of $20 million, if I remember the terms correctly. Well, divorce, of course. Wow, was all David managed to squeeze out. He suddenly imagined how Phillips was now sitting in an expensive office, losing control of himself, realizing that this prank had backfired on him, not only in a moral sense. At work, the boss is most likely already under the supervision of the board of directors or owners, because no one needs reputational scandals in their large company. They are already offering him to resign of his own free will, Brian added, confirming the guesses. So your respected boss loses his position, and probably his wife, and a huge amount of money. He may not even be able to continue his career in that field. Some companies will not get involved with a person who has tainted himself with such a scandal. David sat silently, thinking about this whole tangle of events. On the one hand, this evoked a disgusting feeling. Rejoicing in other people's misfortunes was the last thing to do. On the other hand, deep down in his soul, he really felt relief and even something like a hidden triumph. He won't steal anything else from me, flashed through my head. It may be petty, but he could no longer hide his vague smile. Finally, it turned out that the blow that was dealt to David was returned to those who decided to destroy his life. So, the lawyer summed up, I think you shouldn't take drastic steps. Of course, there is a desire to take revenge, to criticize Laura at every opportunity, but perhaps it will be calmer to let these events take their course. Phillips has already been punished, and very seriously, and your wife will lose a source of influence because she no longer has a patron in your work environment. She will have to explain herself to her children and friends why everything turned out this way. Yes, perhaps you're right, David agreed, still feeling bitter inside, but a little lighter than before. I would never want it to happen exactly like this, but it seems that justice sometimes works. When he went outside, the rain intensified. Cold drops knocked on the car and flowed down in streams. But for the first time in recent days, David caught himself thinking that he did not feel a dull pain in his chest, and not at all because he suddenly felt truly joyful. Rather, he felt a pleasant realization. The worst was over, and the people who betrayed him were getting what they deserved. Internally, he still understood that a difficult divorce, conversations with children, and a long process of emotional recovery lay ahead. But now he had the feeling that there was solid ground under his feet. Phillips no longer stands over him as a boss, no longer presses him with power in the office. Laura, who has lost several patrons at once, will understand that life is not such a carefree adventure as she saw it while she was fooling her husband. Taking his mobile phone, David opened his contact list and looked thoughtfully at the familiar names of his colleagues. He imagined someone texting or trying to call soon. Hey, have you heard about James? It looks like he was kicked out of the company. Whatever David's feelings about gossip in the past, he may have to dive a little deeper into it now that the story is affecting his career as well. But I no longer felt afraid of such conversations. On the contrary, for the first time, a slight feeling of liberation arose. Well, let everyone know, he thought. He returned to the car and sat for a while, listening to the drumming of the rain on the roof. The picture was still before my eyes. Phillips's smile at meetings, his imposing walk along the office corridors. How many employees might Phillips have quietly set up or humiliated? David didn't know. But one thing was clear. This man lost not only his job, but also his wife, and for a colossal amount. It was impossible to interfere with someone else's family, flashed through my head, even though this is too simple a moral. He found himself smiling to himself, not maliciously, not triumphantly, but as a person who sees that a moment of justice happens in life. It was a very bitter victory, but still a victory. He didn't take revenge on purpose. Everything happened without his intervention. One way or another, the first round was his. The call from the messenger came at the most inopportune moment. David was sitting in the car, thinking about how to talk to the children. Maddie's number flashed on the screen. At first, he felt a sudden joy. Finally, his daughter herself wanted to contact him. But when he answered, he heard dryly, "Can we see you? Me and Travis. But let's not have any drama. Meet me at Chicken Farm near the shopping center." An uneasy feeling settled in David's soul. Whatever the children may think, their mother essentially destroyed the family. But he knew, teenagers have their own logic, and they can perceive everything differently. All the same, a meeting is necessary. He agreed to the proposed place, although it seemed strange to him to talk about such important things in fast food under the smell of cheap burgers. A few hours later, he walked into Chicken Fame, one of those big fast food chain restaurants with bright posters, a buzz of customers, and endless lines at the cash register. I noticed my kids at a table by the window. Maddie with a bun of reddish blonde hair, headphones on, and Travis hunched over the phone. Nearby stood a half-drunk soda and a cardboard box of French fries. "Hi," David said, trying to make his voice soft. "Hi," Maddie said, barely looking at her father. Travis nodded curtly, staring at the screen. David sat down opposite him and swallowed a lump, suddenly realizing that he had not seen them so close for a long time. A couple of weeks ago, he himself avoided the meeting, not knowing how to explain what had happened. Now everything happened on their initiative, but in their eyes there was neither compassion nor interest. More likely, indifference mixed with slight irritation. "How are you?" asked David. "Is Mom okay?" "Everything is fine," Travis muttered. "We actually wanted to talk about your quirks about divorce." David clenched his palms. I shivered. Kooky. The children, apparently, heard the story only from Laura's side, or maybe they didn't really delve into the essence at all. "I understand that this is unpleasant for you, but I cannot stay in a house where there is no respect," he began, choosing his words carefully. "This decision came to me after what I saw." The words came hard. He didn't want to talk about Laura's provocative behavior or her many lovers, but it wasn't easy to remain silent either. "It was just sex, Dad," Maddie said, crossing her arms over her chest. "Mom says that this is not a reason to destroy everything. Moreover, she was unhappy, and you were at work all the time." David turned pale, as if a stone had suddenly been thrown at him. "Just sex." His eyes flickered to Travis, but he just shrugged. "Seriously, Dad, we don't want you to drag us into all this squabbles. Moreover, my mother already has a better boyfriend." My throat tightened, and the air seemed stuck. These words sounded like a prickly wind. Better guy. Since when do kids rate him as the worst candidate? Or are they too young to understand the essence of betrayal? Guys. David lowered his voice. "Do you have any idea what I had to experience?" "Stop it," Maddie waved it off. "It's all gone. And let's not be dramatic. Mom now has Jake. He's funny, cool, and takes us to cool places. I have never seen her so happy." David's heart sank painfully. He was afraid that the children would turn away, but he did not expect such harshness. His son and daughter, whom he loved and tried to provide with everything they needed, are now sitting opposite and openly saying that they don't need them, that their mother and her new partner are better. "I understand that you have grown," he said finally, "and I never wanted to disturb you. However, your mother made her choice, and I do not agree." "We're not asking you whether you agree or not," Travis interrupted him, throwing an impudent glance. "At least Mom didn't leave us, and you just ran away." David felt like everything inside was breaking. He tried to remain calm, but any phrase that the children uttered became a blow. They don't want to see how serious everything is. In their eyes, he looks almost guilty. He guessed that Laura might have presented the situation to them in a light that was convenient for her. Dad couldn't stand it, he left, and now we're happy without him. So, he said quietly, feeling a nervous shiver running through his body. "Do you want me not to interfere anymore, so that there is no showdown?" "Exactly," Maddie nodded. "We came to say that we feel good, Dad. We don't need your remorse." Travis glanced sideways at his sister, as if confirming her words. David closed his eyes for a second and tried to collect his thoughts. He understood that he was trying to fight a hurricane when there was no point in even trying. In some monstrous way, Laura convinced the children that all this was a trifle, and Dad was exaggerating. Or even worse, they themselves decided that living with a new, cool adult was more fun than living with a father who was away at work to pay for their housing and education. Okay, he swallowed hard. It looks like you don't need my support. David pulled the prepared check from his pocket. His lawyer suggested that this could also be done. Pay a lump sum for the children until their 18th birthday in order to avoid constant involvement in any disputes. This decision was not easy for him, but the isolation of the children killed any doubts. He clearly wrote the amount in the column with a pen, and the figure was considerable, calculated on education, clothing, pocket money, medical expenses. Then, in the purpose of payment column, he made a short but poignant entry: full payment for renunciation of paternity. Looking at this check, at the even letters, David felt a strange emptiness. Like the clay cup that was his fatherhood, he now broke it with his own hands, giving his children all financial support, but refusing to fight for their favor. "What is this?" Travis asked, with poorly concealed curiosity, seeing his father carefully hand over the check. Maddie took it first, read it, and indignation flashed across her face. She looked at her father. "Are you kidding me?" "No," he answered quietly. "There's enough here that you won't need it until you're 18. This is the only thing I'll be useful to you for, apparently, since you think that I should stop being dramatic and not interfere with your happiness." He threw up his hands tiredly. "Then accept this as the last contribution to your life." Maddie threw the check on the table as if she had been burned. Travis leaned forward and took the document, his eyes sparkling. "Have you decided that we are ready to give up on you for money?" The question took David by surprise, but he was already in a state of complete internal breakdown. Lifting his chin, he said, "You yourself made it clear that you don't need me. I'm just making sure you don't have financial problems." Maddie's eyes sparkled. David's heart sank. It seemed to him that he saw new traits in his daughter, evil, cold. Maybe it's just teenage stubbornness coupled with resentment, but he was tired of breaking through the wall of mistrust to them. "Do what you want," Maddie said. "Maybe Mom will refuse to take such dirty money, or he'll take it and spend it on a trip with Jake. I don't know." Travis stood up abruptly and crushed the cardboard cup of Coke. "You probably think that we will die without you. And we're fine. Jake is awesome, and you can't beat him, Dad." Something inside David snapped completely. Once upon a time, he was ready to give everything so that his children would grow up happy, study well, and do what they love. He never thought that a moment would come when they could not see that he was suffering and was trying to maintain at least a shadow of a normal relationship. "Then so be it," he said, getting up. With difficulty, he put the check back into his breast pocket. Silence hung for a moment, interrupted only by the noise in the hall. Somewhere nearby, other teenagers were screaming, laughing at the memes, tearing open bags of wings. For them, this is an ordinary evening, but for David, it is the point of no return. "I won't fight," he said dully, not looking at the children, "since you have decided so." "You shouldn't have left," Travis suddenly said dully, an emotion similar to wounded flashed in his voice. David realized that his son continued to blame him for running away, as if his mother had nothing to do with it. But I no longer had the strength to explain. He nodded. "Thank you for coming. Take my contacts, you know them. If you need anything, please contact us." "Yeah," Maddie said, not meeting his gaze. He turned and walked towards the exit. Through the glass of the front door, you could see the lights of cars in the parking lot, and somewhere near the sidewalk a taxi was honking. David paused for a moment to catch his breath. Tears welled up, but he clenched his jaw. Not now. And why? He raised these children, thinking that they would become a support in life, but in fact, it seems that anger and disappointed hopes prevailed over him. It was fresh outside, and a slight wind blew the advertising posters at the entrance. David pulled out the check and looked again at the words written, "Full payment for renunciation of paternity." He exhaled shakily and tore it in two, throwing the pieces into the trash can by the door. At that moment, he felt absolutely empty. The teenagers may not have understood the pain that permeated his every step. Or they, sincerely offended that the father couldn't stand it, made a choice in favor of the mother, considering betrayal a trifle. David got into his car and rested his forehead on the steering wheel. Previously, he believed that no matter how his relationship with his wife developed, his children would still remain in a deep connection with him because he was a father. But now reality was hitting him hard. They don't need my version of the truth, he thought bitterly. They prefer to see me as the guilty one and protect my mother. He started the engine and turned on the headlights. Looking in the mirror, David still hoped that the children would jump out of the fast food, call him, say, "Dad, come back." But the door never opened. He backed up and pulled out of the parking lot, the neon sign shining behind him. The autumn wind in Charlotte blew through wide streets where glass office towers reflected the gray sky. For David Turner, this city became a refuge after he quietly divorced his wife. Leaving his old life, he hoped to hide behind the brick walls of a new place, behind thick folders of bank statements and distant business negotiations. He was sheltered by Carolina Finance Corporation, a reputable bank that values professionalism and results. David passed the interview without any difficulties. A brilliant resume, recommendations, and a confident tone did the trick. He was given an office on the 15th floor and tasked with managing large accounts. At first, his colleagues treated him with curiosity. Who was this new guy who joined the management so quickly? But very soon they noticed that Mr. Turner avoided any personal contact. He would show up at the office early in the morning, spend the entire day poring over numbers, and then disappear in the evening without saying goodbye to anyone. At the same time, he did not make a single mistake in the documents, always met deadlines, and found profitable investment solutions. It seemed that in David the bank had found an ideal employee, but behind his back there were conversations. He is cold. He never smiles. His eyes are like those of a man who has seen too much pain. For several months he did not make a single friendship. His subordinates obeyed him behind the scenes because they were afraid to break his deep silence. Even if someone had ideas on how to improve the work process, people did not dare to go to the dead-inside boss. It seemed to some that he was looking through any interlocutor, not noticing his feelings and personality. In fact, David really preferred not to touch other people's emotions. His own were still stung by an unhealed wound after his wife's betrayal and misunderstanding on the part of his children. One morning, when he, as usual, was deep in checking contracts, the office door suddenly swung open. A woman of average height with neatly collected dark hair and a confident look stood on the threshold. "Good morning, Mr. Turner. I'm Isabel Rodriguez, Personnel Onboarding. Can I come in?" Although she had already entered without even waiting for permission, David raised an eyebrow. "What do you owe?" "I wanted to talk about your leadership style. Colleagues are worried that you are ignoring them. People are uncomfortable. We at the bank attach importance to the working climate, but you create an atmosphere of alienation." David listened in silence, frowning slightly. No one had dared to speak to him so directly before. "I'm doing my job. Are there any complaints about the results?" "As for the results, no. You are an excellent specialist. But your coldness is frightening. Newbies, for example, are afraid to ask you questions. They are afraid that you will brush them off, or even reprimand them for saying too much." He crossed his arms over his chest. "Perhaps they are too sensitive. We are not here for friendship, but for profit." Isabel took a step closer. "But people are also a resource. If you alienate employees, productivity suffers, and I think you can find a common language with them if you want. By the way, in a couple of days, we are having a reception on the occasion of a deal with a major client. I wish you could come." David sighed heavily. He didn't like corporate events and always left the office when his colleagues started something like that. "I'm not sure I'll have anything to do there." "Your department expects you to congratulate them and say a few warm words about their teamwork. Believe me, sometimes even a small step towards communication changes your attitude for the better." He wanted to object, but he saw firm determination in her eyes. Rarely did anyone speak to him in such a tone, not impudent, but not ingratiatingly either. Something inside him trembled. as if a person was trying to discern in him not a soulless machine, but a personality. "Okay," he said finally, "I'll try to come to this buffet." Isabel smiled at one corner of her lips. "Thank you. I think you won't regret it." After she left, David sat for a long time, trying to delve into the agreement again. But thoughts about the conversation with Rodriguez did not go away. Why does she need this, he thought, probably trying to justify his position. But somewhere in the depths of her consciousness, another assumption flared up. Maybe she senses that behind his aloofness lies a burning pain and wants to help. The day of the buffet has arrived. In the morning, there was a business meeting with a new client, and the deal took place. Everyone was in high spirits. The employees wanted to celebrate the success. They set up several tables, set out drinks and snacks. Low music was playing in the corner of the meeting room. David looked at this with his usual cold detachment, but remembered Isabel's words and decided to stay. At first, he felt like a stranger. I stood at the window, holding a glass of mineral water in my hand, watching others laugh and chat. But gradually people began to approach him, some boldly, some warily. "Thank you for your support at the presentation. You proposed an excellent solution. With your forecasts, we turned out to be a plus." Such phrases were addressed to him over and over again. David answered with restraint, but not so sharply. He noticed that the employees were smiling at him rather than shying away. About 20 minutes later, he saw Isabel. She held a small glass of juice and looked at him softly, as if encouragingly. David read on her face, "Well, it's not so scary to be with everyone, right?" He nodded at her without saying a word. Then I started talking to a young analyst who timidly talked about his ideas for automating some of the reports. Instead of brushing it off as usual, David began asking clarifying questions. The guy perked up, even took out a tablet and showed some of his work. And David suddenly caught himself thinking that he was not so bored. He saw benefit in these ideas and felt how his subordinate was inspired by his attention. When the buffet was in full swing, the employees raised a toast to a successful deal. David didn't expect that he would also be asked to say a few words. But the eyes were turned to him, and he said briefly, "Thank you for the excellent work. We have concluded a good agreement, and this is the merit of each of you. I am glad that I have such specialists in my department." The simple phrases sounded sincere, and those present unanimously applauded. David felt embarrassed, but at the same time felt quiet satisfaction. He hadn't had to say something like that in a very long time. He wasn't sure it was worth continuing, but he could see people's eyes lighting up. They were really happy that their boss was recognizing their contributions. When the holiday ended and most of the employees left, only a few helped clean the meeting room. David was about to leave when he saw Isabel. She bent over the boxes, collecting the remains of papers, and, noticing him, smiled. "Thank you for staying. See, it's not so scary." "Probably," he answered, looking around the emptying room. "For many years I tried to keep a low profile. Too much has happened." Isabel nodded without asking questions. There was understanding in her eyes. If he wants, he will tell him himself. "Sometimes we are so afraid of getting burned that we build walls around ourselves," she said quietly. "But if the walls are too high, we won't let the good things in." David remembered the day his life collapsed right in front of him in the family bedroom. How much pain he endured later, while he was driving to nowhere, while he cut off everything from himself, including the children who did not want to listen to his truth. "Maybe I'm really shutting myself off too much," he thought. "You seem to be an expert not only in personnel adaptation, but also in psychology." David tried to laugh it off. Isabel laughed almost silently. "My job is to help people find balance. It's amazing how many employees come to the corporate environment with mental trauma, but continue to live by inertia." David looked at her. He wanted to say, "Thank you for reminding me that I'm still alive." But the tongue did not turn. In the end, he only said, "Maybe I'll try to be a little more open. I can't promise miracles, but you seem to be right. Keeping everyone at a distance is tiring." Isabel's gaze softened. "That's all we ask. You are an important part of the team, Mr. Turner, and people want to be attracted to you. Just don't scare them away. When he left the office that evening, Charlotte was already blooming outside the windows. He couldn't wait to leave and hide in his lonely apartment, but his soul was a little lighter than usual. He took a small step. He allowed himself to let other people into his space for at least an hour. And oddly enough, the world did not collapse. On the contrary. In those around him, he saw not annoying windbags, but colleagues who needed his gratitude. On the way home, David remembered looking into Isabel's eyes. There was no pity in them, but he felt that she guessed that there were scars deeply hidden inside him that prevented him from moving on. However, now he had a cautious hope. What if, taking step by step, he would be able to learn to live again? And let the past remain in memory, it does not have to kill the future. He stopped at a traffic light, looking at the glowing skyscraper of the bank, in which almost no one was left. I'm still here, he thought, still able to feel something. Thinking about what awaited the new day, he caught himself with a subtle feeling close to anticipation. Perhaps tomorrow he will talk to analysts again about their ideas, or answer someone's questions not with a dry nod, but a little more friendly. Or maybe he'll take a moment to thank his assistant. All these are small things, but for him it is a huge step towards returning to life. As the weeks passed, there was relative stability in the daily life of the bank. Everyone at Carolina Finance Corporation knew that David Turner kept the strictest records of contracts, meticulously monitors the numbers, and is always ready to support any complex transaction. But gradually, they began to treat him less intensely because he learned not to push people away. He did not become the life of the party. He still preferred to work quietly overtime, but the tone of his conversations softened. Colleagues stopped calling him dead inside in whispers. Newcomers no longer flinched when they came into his office with their ideas. Against this background, more and more often, there were moments when he crossed paths with Isabel Rodriguez, the woman who, in fact, was the first to find a loophole to his frozen heart. Although her formal role was to help new employees adapt and resolve internal conflicts, she approached people in a deeper and warmer way. David liked that she did not put pressure on him, did not bombard him with personal questions, but was simply present somewhere nearby, ready to listen if he wanted to talk. One day, during one of his lunch breaks, David, contrary to his habit, decided to go down to the cafeteria. Usually, he took coffee in the office and ate alone, but on this day he wanted to clear his head. Already on the way back, he noticed that several people had gathered in the hall at the administration desk. Among them stood Isabel, holding a folder of papers in one hand and a telephone in the other. Judging by her smile, she was excitedly talking about something with a female intern. David came closer and heard fragments of phrases. Yes, in the end, the rat ate almost the entire cake, and the birthday boy never found out who left it on the table, Isabel said, waving a folder. Come on, what kind of rat? The intern laughed. David involuntarily lingered, listening to this seemingly ridiculous story, and suddenly he felt that the corners of his lips twitched as if he wanted to smile too. He couldn't remember the last time he felt like this. Through the occasional sounds of laughter from those around him, he suddenly remembered how much he had lost the habit of feeling light. And here is a simple joke, some kind of life story that flies into the ears and causes a warm response. As the intern walked away, Isabel noticed David. She rubbed his figure reflected in the glass partition with her gaze and smiled shyly. "Oh, Mr. Turner, you are here too. I hope I didn't make too much noise." "No," he answered. "I just heard your story. It sounded funny." She really was funny. "By the way," Isabel looked at her watch, "you rarely come down for lunch." "Everything is fine?" David nodded. "Yes, I decided to clear my head a little. In the end, I don't want to get completely bogged down in reports." She smiled knowingly. "That's right. Sometimes it's worth looking up from the monitor and looking at the world. Here, even rats can eat someone's cakes." At this phrase, David unexpectedly laughed briefly but resoundingly, so unexpectedly that he trembled with his own laughter. And in this simple impulse, something was revealed that he had long kept under lock and key, a lively response to someone else's cheerfulness. "Sorry," he said, embarrassed. catching himself thinking that he had missed such a natural reaction. "It's okay. Laughter suits you," Isabel remarked, looking him straight in the eyes. David felt something sink inside him and then rise again, creating a feeling of gentle excitement. He didn't want to break off and go into the usual dull distance. He replied, "Thank you. I didn't think anyone would ever see me laugh." "Everything sometimes happens for the first time or a second time," Isabel said quietly. She walked away, leaving him in a slight haze of incomprehensible emotions. And he, returning to his room, several times caught himself raising his hand to his mouth to hide the sudden smile that appeared, remembering the incident with the rat and the cake. Over time, their short crossings became regular. Either Isabel will look into the office with some documents about a new employee, then David will notice her in the corridor, and they will exchange a few humorous phrases. She knew how, unlike many, to approach tactfully, without interrogating, but at the same time making it clear that she was ready to communicate. One day, late in the evening, when the office was almost empty, she knocked on his door. She held a box of Chinese takeout noodles in her hands and grinned. "I saw that you didn't come out for dinner. Maybe you can join me." David looked up from the report and nodded, not feeling his usual aversion to having his personal space invaded. "Yes, thank you. I just haven't had time to eat yet." They moved the meeting table to the window, unpacked the noodles, and took out plastic forks. The office was in partial shade, with only the neon light of the city street filtering through the glass. David felt strange, like a child trying something unusual for the first time at school after school. "How long have you been working here?" he asked Isabel when the first portions of noodles were eaten. "The 5th year has begun. I used to work in a small HR company, and then I came to Carolina. I like helping people find mutual understanding." "And you really like to solve other people's problems." David grinned. "Sounds like constant stress." "Maybe so," she leaned back in her chair, "but I've seen situations where, after a serious quarrel, people later became friends or work partners. When you realize that somewhere you helped smooth out the corners and restore mutual respect, you feel the return." David nodded, feeling that she really liked her job, and suddenly he asked, "Do you have your own story, because of which you value peace between people so much?" She thought for a moment, looking down as if deciding whether to reveal it. But then, apparently, she decided that he deserved honesty. "My father left us when I was 12, and my mother took it hard, blaming everyone around her. It took years for her and me to learn to laugh again. She believed that all men were traitors. And I don't want to live in a world where every mistake turns into eternal hatred. It's better to find out everything and try to build something anew." "I understand," David answered quietly, digesting what he had heard. "I also had a breakup, although it happened quite recently." He didn't go into detail, but Isabel saw a hint of pain in his face. Looking at him with a mixture of sympathy and respect, she encouraged, "Sometimes all we can do is admit. We can't rewrite the past, but we can change our attitude towards the future." David felt his heart clench in his chest. Attitude towards the future, he repeated to himself. He lived for so many months, even years, as if without a future, and now a timid light began to creep into his life. And one of the reasons is that here she is, sitting opposite in the twilight of the office, eating noodles, talking about her traumas from childhood, not embarrassed to show real emotions. Of course, they did not become instant close friends. Both were careful about personal details. However, unbeknownst to David himself, their communication deepened. They sometimes went out for lunch outside the bank, eating sandwiches in a nearby park or drinking coffee in a small coffee shop. Sometimes they talked about trifles, about who oversalted the soup in the canteen or which company had the most profitable office supplies. And sometimes the conversation turned into a more personal direction. David timidly mentioned that he had been married for 17 years. Isabel shared stories of how she tried to re-establish contact with her father's relatives, but was unsuccessful. One Friday evening, David decided to invite her for a walk after work to stroll along the embankment, where, as he heard, You can feed the ducks and look at the lights of the big city reflected in the water. Never before had he suggested this to either his colleagues, much less the head of the HR department. But something inside prompted him to take a risk. Isabel, to his relief, agreed with a smile. I was just thinking about what to do on Friday evening. So you save me from boredom. That evening David found himself laughing again. About halfway to the embankment, when they got out of the car and walked along the illuminated alley, Isabel took a bag of bird feed mixture that she had purchased in advance. But suddenly a gust of wind tore it from her hand, and all the seeds scattered on the asphalt. "Oh," she exclaimed with comical bewilderment. "It seems the ducks will be left without dinner today." David involuntarily laughed, seeing how she froze with an empty bag in her hands, and suddenly realized that this was not annoying, but making her laugh to the point of tears. A trifle, but how much simple vital warmth there is in it. He managed to notice how a random passerby also grinned, observing their scene. And David suddenly felt that life doesn't have to be an eternal drama. There are funny, kind little things that bring you closer together. In the evening, when they stood on the railing of the embankment and looked at the reflections of the city lights in the water, two feelings were fighting in David: gratitude for the opportunity to enjoy little things again, and the aching pain from the memory that he had once had family happiness and lost it. But Isabel seemed to sense his inner struggle, because she said quietly, "You know, I'm not your ex, and you're not my ex. We're just us. Here and now." It sounded unexpectedly straightforward. David looked into her eyes and saw confidence there. "Yes," he said, feeling his heart skip a beat. "You're right. I measure everything by the past too often." She smiled. "The past cannot be erased, but it should not deprive us of the future." There was no sentimental false romance in these words that he had once despised. There was only the honesty of two people, each with scars behind them that were still more than a year old. But they stood side by side, listening to the sound of water and the distant sounds of cars, realizing that they were able to give each other a spark of warmth. After that walk, their communication became more natural, even casual. They could have dinner together, sometimes doing it spontaneously, staying late in the office. They could exchange jokes at a chance meeting in the corridor. And although neither of them directly called it a relationship, neither David nor Isabel denied that some kind of emotional connection was being born between them. At times, waves of fear washed over David. He remembered how he had once been confident in the eternity of the marital union, but in the end, he received the shock of betrayal. What if everything happens again? But looking at Isabel's calm face, hearing her usual, "Good morning, Mr. Turner," sometimes with a teasing tone, he understood every time. She did not have that secret cunning that he was so afraid of. With her, you can be yourself, tired, overloaded with work, carrying internal traumas. One evening, as he was leaving the office, he accidentally found himself alone in the parking lot. I got into the car, turned on the ignition, and automatically looked in the rearview mirror. To my own surprise, I saw in the reflection not a tortured, devastated man, but a man whose eyes were no longer so gloomy and dull. Leaning towards the mirror, David ran his hand over his face and suddenly smiled, recognizing the fact. "It looks like I'm living again." Laughter, conversations, personal confessions, all this helped him thaw step by step, as if thick ice was finally cracking. He was still afraid to talk about his ex-wife and children, but he no longer perceived this fear as a reason to close the door to any contact. One day, in a conversation with Isabel, he briefly mentioned children, and she carefully asked, "Do you still keep in touch?" David responded bitterly, "They think I abandoned them. Or maybe their mother convinced them that it was. I'm not sure I want to reopen old wounds." Isabel did not give advice. She just smiled sympathetically. "When the day comes and you are ready, they may be ready too. Or not. But until you work through your pain yourself, you are unlikely to be able to return to them." Everything inside David turned upside down. He understood that she was right. You couldn't hold a grudge forever, but he'll deal with that later. Now she was helping him find warmth, the very thing that would eventually allow him to decide on further steps. Several more years have passed since the day David and Isabel first looked into each other's eyes and took the risk of giving mutual trust a chance. During this time, a lot has changed both at Carolina Finance Corporation and in the personal lives of both. But the most important thing was what was happening inside David Turner himself. As if the long winter had ended, having melted the ice of his loneliness. He no longer ran from the past, although the memories still managed to sting. It's just that now there was a woman next to him who accepted him as he was, without conditions or secret games. Isabel was of Hispanic heritage, although she was born and raised in the United States. Her mother, who lived nearby, spoke mostly Spanish. David quickly realized that if he wanted to truly be a part of Isabel's world, he would need to learn to understand the language her family spoke. At first, it seemed like a difficult task. With other people, David might not have taken such a step. But for her sake, he took up tutorials, downloaded applications to his phone, and even signed up for short courses twice a week in the evening after work. At first, the letters and sounds seemed confusing to him. He made mistakes in pronunciation, confused sir and estar, said bien instead of bueno, but did not give up. Every evening I studied new words and tried to read short stories in Spanish. Isabel looked at this with surprised tenderness. She never asked him to learn the language of her childhood, but seeing that he was trying on his own, she helped him correct his pronunciation and patiently explained how phrases were built. She put on Latin American films with subtitles on and watched them with him. Over time, David noticed that familiar words began to pop up in his head without tension. He could already smile at Isabel's mother and say, "Buenas tardes, señora," and she, in response, joyfully patted him on the shoulder. He understood that this step was not only to master a new language, but also to remove any barriers between him and Isabel once and for all. Although David had more and more confidence in his soul that he would find true happiness with Isabel, the cherished words, "be my wife," did not escape his lips for a long time. He was still bothered by old fears. What if someone betrayed him again? What if he can't live up to expectations? However, everyday life together with Isabel became so natural that one evening, when the two of them were preparing dinner in his kitchen, actually chatting more than cooking, David suddenly realized he could not see himself without this woman. Without her smile, ability to listen, without her easy laughter. And I decided it was time to take a step. To buy an engagement ring, he went to the same jewelry store where he had once gone with the hope of a better future, the same thing that had not come true in the past. Now he stood at the display window, slightly worried, choosing a ring with a small, elegant stone. He didn't want anything fancy. The main thing is that the ring reflects the essence of their relationship: modesty, sincerity, trust. The store consultant, seeing that the client was clearly worried, politely helped determine the size and shape. The next day, returning from work a little earlier, David set the table, lit a couple of candles, and put flowers in a vase. Isabel came to his house. Noticing the change in the situation, she smiled. "What holiday is today?" David swallowed, feeling his throat dry, but decided. "Celebration of a new chapter in our lives." And taking out a small box, he got down on one knee. Having difficulty pronouncing the words that I had imagined thousands of times in my head, "Isabel Rodriguez, you made my life brighter. Be my wife." She sighed softly, pressing her hand to her lips. Tears of joy sparkled in her eyes. Then she answered with a simple yes, leaning towards him and hugging him. At that moment, David realized that the past no longer had the same power over him. He believed that this offer was a sign he could love and trust again on different terms with another person. Preparations for the wedding were not pompous. Isabel jokingly said, "I don't want a 10-meter veil. The spiritual atmosphere and close people nearby are more important to me." They chose a cozy restaurant on the outskirts of Charlotte that had a small garden. Isabel's colleagues, friends, and relatives were invited. Mother, of course, insisted that there be a band playing Latin tunes and a table set with traditional dishes. On the wedding day, David felt a nervous tremor, not from fear, but from pleasant excitement. He stood in the garden at a makeshift arch, looking at his watch. Colleagues from the bank teased. "Well, Turner, who would have thought that you would dare?" He smiled back. And so Isabel came out to him to the accompaniment of gentle music. She was wearing a simple white dress, her hair was softly styled, and she was holding a bouquet. As she approached, David saw in her gaze the calmness and confidence with which she had once entered his life without knocking. No secrets, no late calls or lies flashed through David's head. He promised himself that this time he would not allow deception to enter his marriage. They exchanged short vows in front of a small audience of family and friends. Then there was applause and the music got louder. The holiday was sincere. There was no pompous officialdom, rather a feeling that one big family had gathered. Mom Isabel hugged her new son-in-law with tears and said in Spanish that he was now, my hijo, a son. David, embarrassed, could only quietly answer, "Gracias, Mama," and this caused friendly laughter from the guests. Finally, he felt that he was not a stranger in this family. A year after the wedding, a new miracle happened. Isabel became pregnant. Upon learning of the pregnancy, David felt both elation and fear. He was already a father once, and in his past life everything ended sadly, but now he had a chance to do everything differently. He prepared thoroughly. He read books on how to help his wife during pregnancy, went with her to consultations, and even wrote down the doctor's comments in a notebook. When the due date came, Isabel went to the maternity hospital, and David was almost speechless with excitement. But everything went relatively calmly, and in the evening he was already looking at the tiny face of his newborn daughter, who was named Sophia. That moment when he first held her in his arms pierced him to the core. It was a moment of absolute miracle. The tiny creature, his daughter, looked at him as if meaningfully, although she was only a few hours old. "Hello, Sophia," he whispered, and his heart ached from the love that he had once deprived himself of. Isabel, tired but happy, smiled from her bed. "It seems like she already recognizes your voice. I will be the most reliable father for her." David said this so firmly that he was surprised. He was not going to repeat old mistakes. He did not want to pretend that the child existed somewhere nearby. No, now David intended to be responsible every minute, to be included in Sophia's life from the very beginning. He didn't care that sometimes he would have to change diapers at night, carry a stroller, or miss evening delays at work. He knew it was priceless. A few months after Sophia was born, David realized how much his routine was changing. Not long ago, he was the last one to leave the office, immersed in reports, and now he was waiting for the strike of 6 in the evening so that he could go home early. Colleagues noticed the changes. He joked with them, told funny episodes about night vigils over the baby's crib. No one recognized in this man the reserved and cold banker he had once been. Isabel was literally glowing too. Despite the lack of sleep and troubles with the baby, she radiated calm joy. Sometimes she would sit next to David when Sophia was sleeping peacefully and say quietly, "You know, I'm glad we're together, and I don't regret for a moment that you took the risk, and neither do I." "I'm glad too," he answered in a whisper, trying not to wake the baby, "and I will do everything to ensure that our home remains filled with trust." Sometimes David caught himself thinking that in his previous family he also seemed to have children. But there, alas, there was no mutual intimacy or trust left. One day he tried to write a letter to Maddie and Travis, sending them short messages about how he was doing and that their sister would soon be born. I did not receive an answer. I knew that the children had grown up, perhaps were offended by their father or had completely taken the mother's side. So be it. He retained a faint hope that someday they would still want to reconsider their relationship. But now he had Sophia, for whom he vowed to become a good father. "I'm doing this consciously," he repeated to himself, rocking the baby. It happened when Sophia cried at night, exhausted by colic. Isabel looked at David with sympathy, saying, "Go to sleep. Tomorrow you have to work." But he stubbornly shook his head, wanting to share all the troubles equally. And the next morning, even though he had not slept, he went to the office with a smile. Several years of peaceful and measured life passed. David got used to a new routine. Work at the bank took up part of his time, but his family became much more important to him. Isabel, Sophia, a new reality was built around them, where there was no place for the old grievances. Small chores around the house, dinners together, rare but warm meetings with friends, all this became a routine that David, deep down, considered priceless. That day, he was driving home as usual when the phone on the next seat vibrated. Stopping at a traffic light, David glanced at the screen. The number was unfamiliar. Usually, he did not answer such calls, but for some reason this time he decided to answer the phone. The voice on the other end of the line, quiet and excited, became a bolt from the blue for him. "Dad, it's me, Maddie." He barely had time to react when a horn sounded from behind the traffic light had already switched. David slammed on the gas, pulled over and stopped, his heart pounding as if he had run 100 meters. How many years has it been since they spoke? When he tried to contact the children in the past, neither Maddie nor Travis responded, and now the daughter's voice broke the silence of the years. "Maddie," he said carefully, "how are you? Everything is fine?" "Yes, well." The voice sounded intermittently. "I wanted to call for a long time, but I didn't dare. Sorry it took so long, Dad. I am getting married, and I really want you to lead me to the altar. Sorry, when I was a teenager, I didn't understand a lot." David was silent, squeezing the steering wheel, as if he was looking for a foothold in reality. These words took my breath away. His daughter, whom he once rocked in his arms, is now getting ready to get married and suddenly wants him, the father, to walk her down the aisle. "Are you sure?" That's all he asked, mechanically checking whether he had heard correctly. "Yes," Maddie answered quietly. "I am in a serious relationship. We have been together for more than a year. I really want you to be with me on this day. Dad, I realized that everything was not as my mother said. I didn't know the whole truth. I understand that I hurt you, but—" She broke down mid-sentence as if she was sobbing. David was not ready for such emotions. Resentment and relief fought within him. When the children turned their backs on him, he seemed to have buried himself as a father. But at that same moment, all those years when he didn't see Maddie growing up, didn't know her thoughts, didn't hold her hand in difficult moments came before his eyes. Will he now be able to simply say, "Of course, daughter, I forgive you"? "Maddie," he finally said, "I don't know what to say. This is unexpected. I need to think." "I understand," she answered bluntly, "but please, at least meet me. Let's talk. I really want you to be with me on my wedding day." After ending the call, David sat in the car for a few more minutes, trying to cope with the storm of thoughts. Then he started the engine and drove home. Along the way, he painfully remembered the last time he saw his daughter. It was when she defiantly said, "Jake is better than you," and slammed the door before he left. Since then, all communication has been severed, and now an invitation to the altar. In the evening, when Sophia had already fallen asleep, he quietly went to Isabel, who was ironing freshly washed linen. She noticed his excitement. "Did something happen?" "Maddie called," he admitted, sitting down on a chair. "She's getting married and wants me to walk her down the aisle. She says, 'Sorry, I was a teenager.'" Isabel put down the iron and sat down next to her. "And how did you answer her?" "Nothing specific. Said I needed time." He sighed, looking down at his hands. "I've been storing up a grudge for so many years, and now, on the one hand, I'm glad that she remembered me. On the other hand, I'm afraid this is only for the wedding, and then everything will return to its previous state." Isabel put her hand on his shoulder. "I think it's worth the risk. This is your daughter, and she's clearly sorry. Yes, it may hurt you if things don't work out, but if you don't try, you'll never know if the relationship can be repaired." David nodded, realizing that she was saying reasonable things. Deep down, he also believed that this chance should not be missed. Perhaps this was exactly what he had been waiting for, the opportunity to be a father to Maddie again, even if the path turns out to be difficult. The next day, he dialed the number from which his daughter called. "Hello, Maddie. I'm ready to meet and talk." There was relief in her daughter's voice. They agreed on a neutral place, a small cafe on the outskirts of the city. David specifically chose a weekday during the day so that everything would take place in silence, without fuss and prying eyes. His heart ached from the old pain, but he tried to tune in to an open dialogue. At the agreed time, David arrived at a modest cafe with wooden tables and the smell of fresh baked goods. He didn't want a pretentious establishment, he wanted an almost homely atmosphere where he could talk without unnecessary glances. Walking inside, I noticed that Maddie was already sitting at a table by the window. Seeing her father, she stood up and impulsively hugged him, almost timidly. David felt how strange it was to smell her shampoo again, to hear the beating of her young heart. But she is no longer a girl. In front of him is an adult woman, no matter how unusual it may be to realize this. "Hi," Maddie said, smiling with difficulty. "Hello," he responded, slightly hoarsely. They sat down opposite each other. They were silent for several seconds, looking around as if they didn't know where to start. Finally, Maddie pulled herself together. "Thank you for coming. I was afraid that you wouldn't want to listen to me at all." David swallowed hard. "I had reasons to be offended, but that's already in the past. Tell me, how are you?" She smiled reluctantly. "All these years I lived with my mother, then I moved to another city, studied, and met Rob. He is good, works in a company. And so, we decided to get married, and while we were planning the wedding, I kept thinking about you. Dad, I didn't understand a lot of things back then. Mom suggested that you betrayed us, abandoned us. I was 16, I only saw her version. I was angry and blamed you. And now, a lot has become clearer." She said that Travis joined the army as soon as he turned 18, just to escape the power of Laura and her boyfriends. Maddie moved in with a friend, then into a college dorm, and started earning money on her own. At some point, she heard from friends the truth about her mother and how she behaved while she was married to David. So Maddie realized that everything was far from being as she had been told. "Sorry, Dad," she added quietly. "I was a teenager. I really didn't know the whole truth. And I want you to lead me to the altar." David looked at his grown-up daughter, seeing how her lips trembled, and felt something long ago squeezing in his chest. But along with this pain, a long-forgotten fatherly warmth suddenly broke through. "Okay, Maddie, I'll come to the wedding, and I'll walk you to the altar. It takes time to get used to the idea that you are already an adult." She smiled, and in this smile David saw the same reflection that had once shone in her eyes when she was little and ran to him with the question, "Dad, do you love me?" Now she herself was looking for his love and forgiveness. A couple of months later, another important event happened. Travis returned. He served several years under contract and has now returned to his hometown. Maddie caught him almost on the first day and persuaded him to meet his father and younger half-sister, Sophia. David was nervous because Travis was the one who had rejected him most aggressively as a teenager. But in the depths of my soul, there was also a glimmer of hope. They decided to have a barbecue in the park. David and Isabel with Sophia, Maddie with her fiancé, and Travis joining them. The weather was sunny, and David brought food, charcoal for the grill, and drinks. Maddie brought salads and sweets. Isabel was busy at the portable grill, and Sophia, a mischievous 4-year-old, was running around trying to catch a butterfly. At the appointed time, a motorcycle arrived, driven by a handsome guy in a leather jacket and army combat boots. He took off his helmet and took a quick look at the crowd. David recognized his son immediately, although Travis had changed in appearance. He became taller, broad-shouldered, and an adult seriousness appeared in his eyes. "Hi," Travis said, looking down. "Hello to you too," David replied, a little awkwardly extending his hand, which his son shook, although not too willingly. For several minutes, everyone shifted around, not knowing how to start a conversation. We ended up focusing on barbecue cooking. Maddie tried to lighten the situation with jokes, but Travis remained silent, as if he didn't dare admit that these people could be truly close to him. Then Sophia approached him, holding out a small rubber ball. "Hello, I'm Sophia. Who are you?" Travis looked at her, and a smile appeared on his face. "I'm Travis. I kind of have to be your brother." Consolidated, To be more precise, what is step in? Sophia asked, wrinkling her forehead. This means we have the same dad, but different moms, Travis explained, looking at David. Then he looked away in embarrassment. Sophia just nodded, as if she understood everything, and asked, "Will you play ball with me?" Travis did not immediately, but agreed, and they walked away to the clearing. He threw the ball, and Sophia laughed loudly when he deliberately missed, giving in to her. Gradually, the tension subsided. Maddie and Isabel began chopping vegetables, while David began grilling meat. Travis, out of breath, returned to them and began to talk about his service, about his plans to find a job with a military bias. When the moment came for the two of them to go out to the car for a bottle of water, Travis said in a low voice, "You know, Dad, I'm sorry that I turned away then. I won't lie, I'm immediately ready to hug you as if nothing had happened. But I realized that we were probably wrong. Mom lied, but we believed. You were a teenager. I didn't understand a lot of things either," David admitted, trying to hide the trembling in his voice. "Thank you for coming." They nodded silently to each other, returning to the table to taste the fruits of their joint barbecue. So the family began to recover, slowly, through pain and memories, but the process went on. And David felt like a father again, albeit belatedly, even though the children had grown up long ago, but the lost connection was being revived in his heart. Maddie's wedding day was approaching. They decided to make the celebration modest, without hundreds of guests, but with a warm atmosphere in a small church, and then dinner in a rented hotel room. David was worried. He was going to walk his daughter down the aisle. Having picked up a classic suit, I stood in front of the mirror and still couldn't believe that this was happening. Excitement permeated every cell. While the ceremony was going on in the church, everything went smoothly. David brought Maddie to the groom. Everyone became emotional. The bride almost burst into tears. Receiving congratulations, David felt proud and quiet happiness. In the evening, the guests moved to the hotel banquet hall, where there were toasts, music, and laughter. But towards the middle of the evening, a figure appeared at the entrance, which immediately caused tense whispers. Laura, drunk, exhausted, with a pale face and disheveled hair, she swayed as she walked between the tables. David, noticing her, went cold. Maddie turned pale, clutching her groom's hand. "David," Laura sang, approaching, "you should be with me. We are a family. Come back to me. Come back." Her speech was interrupted by sobs and whispers. Isabel, standing next to her husband, automatically pulled herself up, as if protecting him with herself. Laura noticed this and, with a wry smile, tried to push Isabel away. "Get away from my husband," she shouted. The security of the hall became wary. Two strong guys were already walking towards them, ready to stop the scandal. Laura frantically grabbed David's sleeve, muttering, "We can take everything back." But he stepped back, protecting Isabel. She, without raising her voice, said harshly, "Get your hands off my husband. Now." Laura jumped up and hissed something angrily, but the guards had already carefully led her out of the hall. All the guests sighed, some were shocked. Maddie turned away, holding back tears. The wedding evening was almost ruined by the scene that the mother caused. But the groom hugged Maddie, asked the DJ to turn on the music, and the celebration gradually came to life. David and Isabel had to explain to the guests that this woman is an ex-wife, she is not herself. No one asked much, seeing Laura's condition. A couple of days later, it became known. Laura was hospitalized with a nervous breakdown. She screamed in delirium, as if blaming everyone around her for her misfortune. Maddie and Travis, having received the news, just silently shook their heads. No one wanted to return Laura to the family. She had crossed boundaries too many times, too much deception and pain were left in the past. When the wedding fuss subsided, Maddie finally decided to reveal to her father what she had been silent about for years. They sat on the veranda of David's house while Sophia played in the yard and Isabel went shopping. Maddie asked to talk in private. "Dad, remember how I said that Mom took dubious boyfriends home?" She began hesitantly. "There's something I didn't tell you about." David sensed something was wrong. "I'm listening." When I was 17, my mother disappeared again for a couple of days, leaving me with her then boyfriend. He was drunk and tried to enter my room. He said that Mom allowed it. I locked myself in, propping up the door with a chair. I thought that was it. I was finished. But then Travis returned from training, burst in, and kicked out this freak, almost killing him. I was afraid that everything would break into a scandal, but he left. She exhaled. David listened, clutching the armrest of his chair. The thought of his daughter almost being abused while he was unaware and unable to protect her drove him crazy. Maddie, my God, how? He couldn't finish. I didn't tell you, she admitted, because I was too offended by you and thought that you had abandoned us. And Mom kept us in fear. But since then I realized that she did not care about the safety of her children. She didn't care. David covered his face with his hand. Tears welled up in my eyes. Sorry. I should have been there. I didn't know. He was breathing heavily, trying to calm down his anger at Laura and himself. I don't blame you, Maddie sighed. It's just that now you understand why I don't want to let my mother get close again. And why did she think that she was right in everything until all her deceptions were revealed? You can be sure. David stood up and looked at his daughter. I won't let her get close to you if you don't want it. She hugged her father, and in this hug it was felt that not all the wounds had healed, but sincere attempts to get closer were finally bearing fruit. This was a truth that David did not know, and now he understood how deeply everything had hurt his children. But the awareness of this tragedy only strengthened his decision. He would never again abandon his son and daughter to the mercy of a destructive mother. Time passed and life continued to change. David and Isabel decided to buy a home in the Belmont area, a quiet suburb with spacious yards and leafy streets. Sophia grew up and needed more space to play, and Isabel, noticing that the family was growing stronger, started talking about a second child. And then, after a while, the test showed that she was pregnant. This brought a new wave of joy. They moved into a house in Belmont that had enough space not only for David, Isabel, and Sophia, but also for guests, and guests were frequent. After all, now Maddie and her husband, they got married and were soon expecting a child, as well as Travis, who returned from the army and was about to marry his cousin Isabel, became a large, albeit motley, family. Children's voices intertwined with the laughter and conversations of adults. Every Sunday someone came to visit, brought food, and we gathered at a large table in the garden. Soon Maddie gave birth to a son. David looked at the newborn in his daughter's arms and could not contain his pride, even though he knew that he had missed most of her growing up. Now life was giving him a second chance to be around, albeit in the new status of a grandfather. At the same time, Travis was preparing for the wedding, planning a celebration in a style that combined military symbols and Latin American traditions because his bride is Marisol, Isabel's cousin. Isabel also carried a new life under her heart. The birth went well. Another daughter was born, whom they decided to name Lucia in honor of Isabel's grandmother. Now Sophia was glad that she had a little sister, and David took on the responsibilities of a newborn father with even more enthusiasm than the first time. He was no longer afraid of hopelessness and mistakes. The main thing was that mutual support and trust reigned in the house. No secrets, no late calls, no hidden betrayals, only conscious and open relationships. One sunny evening, this whole large family was sitting in the new yard. Maddie rocked her son, Travis hugged Marisol, who was talking on the phone with her relatives. Isabel rocked the stroller with the sleeping Lucia, and Sophia ran around, showing her cousin bright toys. David, stepping aside, looked at all this fuss, listened to the laughter, and felt his heart overflowing with joy. He recalled the 17 years he lived with Laura as if it were a dark dream filled with deception and hidden discontent. He once believed that this was exactly what family life looked like, that pain and betrayal were inevitable in it. But now, seeing how people lived next to him whom he really loved and who loved him in return, he understood. These 7 years with Isabel were much more than his entire previous life. They are imbued with real meaning, trust, sincerity, support. Travis noticed that his father was thinking and approached him. Everything is fine. Yes, David replied, smiling. I just thought 17 years with Laura are nothing compared to these 7 years of real life with you all. The son nodded and patted him on the shoulder, understanding what he was talking about. And David turned to his wife. Isabel, feeling his gaze, smiled. She was the one who showed him that love could be pure and never look like an endless lie. He approached carefully and put his arm around her shoulders, feeling with all his being that he had finally found the family he had previously only dreamed of. For a long time, Isabel felt that she was quite happy with their family of three, including Sophia. But one day she admitted to David that she wouldn't mind giving Sophia a brother or sister. David accepted this idea with delight and slight trepidation. In his soul, there lived the conviction that with the birth of each child, it was as if he himself was being born again. At the same time, he did not forget that now he was not 20 years old, and he would have to monitor his wife's health and the order of the house even more carefully. When the pregnancy test showed 2 lines, a festive atmosphere reigned at home. Sophia jumped around her mother and asked, "When will your brother appear?" Although doctors have not yet confirmed the sex of the child. David carefully surrounded Isabel with care. He insisted that she reduce the workload for a while, made sure that she did not carry anything heavy, and that she followed a routine. Of course, Isabel joked that he was too worried because she knew how to take care of herself. But she was pleased to see this affectionate side of her husband. Unlike her previous experience, Isabel now felt much calmer. There was a reliable person nearby who was sincerely involved in everything. So the pregnancy went without much stress. Minor ailments, toxicosis, fatigue were compensated by joy and anticipation of a new family member. And finally, the day of birth arrived. David took his wife to the hospital. Everything went relatively calmly, without complications. A girl named Lucia was born, illuminating the house with new colors. Almost simultaneously with the birth of Lucia, Travis announced that he would marry Marisol. The wedding promised to be noisy because Isabel's family had extensive roots in different cities and even countries. The preparation took a lot of time. It was necessary to choose a place, dresses, and decor. Marisol dreamed of an outdoor ceremony so she could dance to live music. Travis, accustomed to military discipline, was at first lost in the series of wedding affairs. But he quickly pulled himself together, wanting to please the bride. David helped with advice: how to stay calm if something goes wrong, where to turn for catering. Sometimes he noticed that he himself had recently experienced a similar experience in a small format, having married Isabel. Travis listened with respect, no longer looking at his father as if he were a stranger. And more the desire to quickly have his own family manifested itself. The day of the wedding ceremony came. It took place in a country estate, where there were green lawns and a small gazebo decorated with flowers. Guests came from all over the area and from other states, some even from abroad. The wind gently fluttered Marisol's veil as Travis stood at the makeshift altar, looking happy but focused. David sat next to Isabel and noticed how exciting this scene was. His son, once torn from him, was now uniting his life with the girl he loved. And all this with the support of a new big family. There was applause and bilingual cheers as Marisol and Travis said their vows. David looked at Maddie, who was holding her son, and at his wife, who was rocking newborn Lucia. I remembered the old days, leaving home, Laura's betrayal, hurting the children. And suddenly I realized that all this was buried under the current reality. He looked around at the motley group of guests, Maddie and her husband, visiting friends, Isabel's Latin American relatives, and realized that this is exactly what his triumph looks like. Not high-profile careers or awards, but a newfound family in which trust and love reign. After the ceremony, dancing began to Latin music. Marisol moved fierily, and Travis tried to play along with her, although he felt a little constrained. Isabel, laughing, also went out to dance, leaving little Lucia in David's arms. He didn't complain. He stood on the edge of the improvised area and, rocking his daughter, looked at this extravaganza of colors and sounds. Flashes of happiness were reflected on the faces of his family, and David smiled, thinking, "It's good that I didn't give up a second chance." Months passed. Sometimes David learned that Laura was again in some clinic for rehabilitation after an alcoholic breakdown. Maddie and Travis mentioned their mother less and less, only shrugging their shoulders. We don't want a repeat of the old nightmare. There were attempts to contact her, but each time it all ended in new scandals, requests for money or manipulation. In the end, the children decided that it would be better for themselves not to stir up the past. David felt sorry for the woman who had once been his wife and mother of his children, but at the same time, he understood that Laura's fate was the result of her own decisions. He could no longer and did not want to save her, because she had long ceased to be a part of his life. If she suddenly got better and wanted to meet, David would not stand in the way, but he understood well. Whether it was worth trusting was a completely different question. Time passed. The house in Belmont was filled with the noise of children. Sophia was growing up, Lucia was starting to walk, Maddie's son was skipping around the yard. Travis and Marisol would come over on the weekends, sometimes staying overnight as well, having sort of big family get-togethers. David continued to work at the bank, but without the same fanaticism as before. For him, work remained a means of providing for his family, and not the meaning of life. He found meaning in the evenings when they all ate dinner together, sharing news and laughter. One day, when the guests had left and the children had fallen asleep, David and Isabel were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset. She leaned on his shoulder, keeping her hand on his palm. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, noticing that he was looking into the distance. "About how it all turned out," David answered quietly. "I spent 17 years with Laura. I thought that this was my life. And now I understand that these last 7 years with you, with our children, with Maddie and Travis, who returned to me, are many times more valuable. No previous time can compare with this present life." Isabel smiled. "I'm glad you feel that way. The past made you who you are, but the main thing is where you are now." "That's for sure," he agreed. He remembered a long-standing feeling of hopelessness when he left his previous home after learning about his wife's betrayal. It seemed as if the world had collapsed. But fate brought him to Isabel, Sophia, Lucia, returned his children, gave him the opportunity to be a father and grandfather. Maybe not everything worked out perfectly, maybe there were scars left, but he found the main thing: love, freedom, and trust. At the end of this whole journey, David felt that life often throws up challenges, but the most important thing is to have those around who will not betray or lie. Looking back on the past 7 years, he realized that every new day with his family was a priceless gift, and his own heart, once broken, was restored and became stronger than ever. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.